Store owner throws out black woman, only to discover she's an award-winning scientist. The late afternoon sun casts long shadows through the pristine windows of Hawthorne and Sons, an upscale boutique nestled in the heart of Brighton Heights. The establishment, with its polished marble floors and crystal chandeliers, had served the city's elite for over 7 decades. On this particular Tuesday, Dr. Simone Washington stepped through its ornate brass doors, her mind still swimming with equations and research data from the keynote speech she delivered at the National Science Summit merely hours ago. If you love your family, subscribe now and join us for more heartwarming moments. Her comfortable sneakers squeaked slightly against the immaculate floor as she wandered between displays of artfully arranged luxury items. The sound seemed almost offensive in the hushed atmosphere, where even the air felt expensive. She adjusted the strap of her well-worn leather messenger bag, which still contained her presentation materials, and ran her fingers through her natural curls, slightly disheveled from the long day of scientific discourse. The store's lighting created a warm, golden ambience that highlighted the exclusive merchandise: handcrafted leather goods from Italy, delicate crystal pieces from Austria, and jewelry that could fund a small research grant. Simone's attention was drawn to a display of intricately designed silk scarves, remembering how her mother always admired such elegant accessories. Despite her own preference for practical attire, Simone could appreciate the artistry in these pieces, much like she appreciated the elegant symmetry in her molecular research. As she moved through the store, her trained scientist's eye caught subtle movements in her peripheral vision. Trevor Matthews, a young sales associate with carefully styled blonde hair and a crisp navy suit, watched her with poorly concealed suspicion. His manicured hands fidgeted with his silk tie as he observed her casual attire: dark jeans, a comfortable navy blazer over a plain white t-shirt, and those practical sneakers that had carried her through countless hours in the laboratory. Simone pretended not to notice as Trevor whispered something to his colleague, Sarah, who glanced in her direction with barely disguised disdain. She was accustomed to such reactions, having navigated similar situations throughout her career in academia. Instead of acknowledging their behavior, she focused on the task at hand, finding the perfect gift for her mother's upcoming 70th birthday. The gentle classical music playing through hidden speakers did little to mask Trevor's hurried footsteps as he disappeared into the back office. Through the store's carefully arranged displays, Simone caught glimpses of his urgent conversation with an older man she hadn't seen before. Their furtive glances in her direction told her everything she needed to know about the nature of their discussion. Harold Hawthorne III stood in his office, his silver hair perfectly coiffed and his bespoke suit without a single wrinkle, as he listened to Trevor's concerned whispers. At 68, Harold had inherited this business from his father, who had inherited it from his father before him. The store was more than just a business to him. It was a legacy, a symbol of refinement and tradition in a rapidly changing world. Through the security monitors mounted discreetly on his wall, Harold observed the woman Trevor had rushed to tell him about. His eyes narrowed as he watched her examine a crystal vase worth more than most people's monthly salary. Her casual demeanor and understated appearance struck him as out of place in his carefully curated establishment. In his mind, she didn't fit the profile of his usual clientele, the doctors, lawyers, and old money families who had been shopping at Hawthorne and Sons for generations. As he continued to watch, Simone moved to a display of vintage watches, her eyes lighting up as she spotted something that seemed to interest her. Her fingers, though unmarked by rings or manicures, moved with the precise grace of someone accustomed to handling delicate equipment. She pulled out her phone, quickly typing something, perhaps comparing prices, Harold thought with growing irritation. The security footage showed her making her way toward the rare book section, where first editions were displayed behind climate-controlled glass. Harold's jaw tightened as she leaned in close to examine the spines, her breath potentially fogging the meticulously maintained display. That was the final straw for him. With a sharp adjustment of his silk tie, he decided it was time to intervene. The store's ambient lighting caught the subtle gray at his temples as he emerged from his office, projecting an air of authority that had been cultivated over decades in the luxury retail business. His Italian leather shoes made no sound on the marble floor as he approached, but his presence seemed to change the very atmosphere of the store. Other customers, the ones he recognized as regulars, glanced up briefly before returning to their shopping, secure in their belonging in this rarefied space. Simone remained absorbed in examining a first edition of Origin of Species, her mind already forming connections between Darwin's groundbreaking work and her own research in evolutionary biochemistry. She didn't notice Harold's approach until his shadow fell across the display case, breaking her concentration and pulling her attention back to the present moment. The tension in the air was palpable, like the charged atmosphere before a storm. Harold cleared his throat, a sound that managed to convey both politeness and warning. "Can I help you find something?" His voice carried the practiced smoothness of aged whiskey, but beneath it lay an unmistakable chill. His stance, slightly too close for comfort, created an implicit barrier between Simone and the display case. Simone straightened up slowly, her scientific mind automatically cataloging details, the subtle tightening around his eyes, the carefully measured distance he maintained, the way his right hand remained tucked in his pocket while his left gestured vaguely toward the exit. She had experienced enough similar situations to recognize the choreography of prejudice, the familiar dance of assumptions and microaggressions. "I'm actually looking for a birthday gift for my mother," she replied, her voice steady and clear, carrying the same measured tone she used when presenting complex research to skeptical colleagues. "She has a particular interest in vintage accessories." The words hung in the air between them, a simple statement of purpose that somehow seemed inadequate in the face of Harold's obvious skepticism. Harold's eyebrows lifted slightly, the gesture so subtle it might have been imperceptible to someone less observant. "I see," he said, in a tone that suggested he didn't see at all. "Perhaps you might be more comfortable at one of the department stores downtown? They have quite a reasonable selection." His emphasis on reasonable carried the weight of all his unspoken assumptions. The classical music playing softly in the background seemed to grow louder in the tense silence that followed. Other customers pretended to be absorbed in their shopping, but their stillness betrayed their attention to the unfolding scene. Trevor, the sales associate, hovered nearby, his presence adding another layer of surveillance to the already suffocating atmosphere. Simone felt a familiar pressure building in her chest, the same pressure she'd felt during her doctoral defense, during countless grant presentations, during every moment she'd had to prove herself worthy of occupying spaces others thought she didn't belong in. But years of breaking barriers had taught her to transform that pressure into dignity. "Actually," she responded, her voice carrying the same calm authority she'd used earlier that day while explaining complex molecular structures to a room full of fellow scientists, "I'm quite comfortable here. The Hermes scarf in your window display would be perfect for her." She named the four-figure price point without flinching, watching as Harold's expression flickered between surprise and disbelief. Harold shifted his weight, his expensive shoes making the slightest sound against the marble floor. His next words came out clipped and precise, like carefully measured ingredients in a toxic recipe. "Madam, I don't mean to be rude, but this establishment caters to a particular clientele. We pride ourselves on maintaining certain standards." The pause before standards stretched long enough to contain volumes of unspoken prejudice. The air conditioning hummed softly, sending a chill through the space that seemed to match the coldness of Harold's demeanor. Simone noticed a younger woman at a nearby display clutch her designer purse closer, as if Simone's mere presence threatened its safety. The gesture would have been almost comical if it weren't so painfully familiar. "I understand completely about standards," Simone replied, reaching into her messenger bag. Harold tensed visibly, but she simply withdrew her phone, pulling up the keynote speaker announcement from that morning's science summit. "Perhaps you'd be interested in discussing the standards of molecular biology? Or perhaps the standards of academic excellence." Her tone remained professional, but carried an edge sharp enough to cut through diamonds. Harold barely glanced at the screen, his dismissal of her credentials as immediate as it was complete. "I must insist," he said, taking a step closer, his voice dropping to ensure only she could hear, "that you leave the premises. We reserve the right to refuse service to anyone who might disturb our other customers." The weight of generations of similar confrontations pressed down on Simone's shoulders, but her posture remained impeccable, the same posture that had carried her through countless lectures, award ceremonies, and groundbreaking research presentations. She looked Harold directly in the eyes, holding his gaze long enough to make him uncomfortable, long enough for him to see the strength and dignity he had chosen to ignore. "Of course," she said finally, her voice carrying just enough volume to reach the ears of nearby customers. "I wouldn't want to disturb anyone with my presence, or my doctorate, or my research grants." Each achievement she listed landed like a gentle rebuke, highlighting the absurdity of his assumptions. As she turned to leave, she moved with the same grace and precision she brought to her laboratory work. Her steps were unhurried, deliberate, each one a silent statement of her right to exist in any space she chose. The sound of her sneakers on the marble floor echoed slightly, creating a rhythm that seemed to underscore her dignity in the face of indignity. At the door, Simone paused, her hand resting on the brass handle. The late afternoon sun streaming through the windows caught the subtle highlights in her natural hair, creating a moment of unexpected beauty that seemed to mock the ugliness of the preceding interaction. She turned slightly, not enough to face Harold directly, but enough to deliver her parting words. "You know what's fascinating about molecular biology?" she asked, her voice carrying the same engaging tone she used in her lectures. "It teaches us that what appears on the surface often has little to do with what lies beneath. Every cell contains the same fundamental potential, regardless of its external appearance." The scientific metaphor hung in the air like a subtle perfume, its meaning impossible to ignore. The other customers had abandoned any pretense of shopping now, their attention caught by the quiet dignity of her exit. Even Trevor, who had been so quick to raise the alarm about her presence, seemed uncomfortable with the situation's resolution. The weight of the moment pressed against the store's carefully maintained atmosphere like a physical force. Harold maintained his rigid posture, but something flickered across his face, perhaps the first seeds of doubt, or maybe just irritation at having his authority challenged so eloquently. The security cameras continued their silent observation, recording a scene that would soon take on far greater significance than anyone in the store could have predicted. As Simone stepped out onto the sidewalk, the door closing behind her with a soft chime, she took a deep breath of the early evening air. The sun had shifted, casting long shadows across the expensive boutiques and galleries that lined the street. In her pocket, her phone buzzed with notifications, probably congratulations from colleagues about her morning keynote speech, ironically celebrating her contributions to a field that transcended the superficial boundaries some people seemed determined to maintain. She walked away from Hawthorne and Sons with her head high, her stride purposeful. The incident would become another story to tell, another example to share with the young scientists she mentored about the importance of perseverance and self-worth. But for now, she simply walked, carrying with her the knowledge that her response to ignorance had been to offer wisdom, even if it hadn't been received. Behind her, through the store's pristine windows, Harold watched her departure, unaware that his world was about to shift on its axis. The crystal chandeliers continued to sparkle, the classical music played on, and the expensive merchandise gleamed under perfect lighting, but something fundamental had changed in the rarefied air of Hawthorne and Sons. The ripples of this encounter would soon expand far beyond the confines of this carefully curated space, touching lives and challenging perspectives in ways that none of them could yet imagine. The last echoes of Simone's footsteps had barely faded when Marcus Chen, a regular customer who had been quietly browsing leather portfolios during the confrontation, approached Harold with deliberate steps. His Italian suit rustled softly as he moved, and the Harvard-class ring on his finger caught the light. As one of the city's most prominent corporate lawyers and a 20-year patron of Hawthorne and Sons, his presence commanded immediate attention. "Harold," Marcus spoke quietly, though his voice carried the weight of 3 decades arguing cases before the Supreme Court. "Do you have any idea what you've just done?" He kept his voice low enough to avoid creating a scene, but the intensity in his words could have carved through steel. Harold adjusted his tie, a nervous habit he developed over 40 years in retail. "Marcus, I assure you, I was simply maintaining the standards this establishment is known for." The words sounded hollow even to his own ears, like a poorly rehearsed line in an amateur theater production. Marcus shook his head slowly, pulling out his phone with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to presenting evidence. "The woman you just expelled from your store?" He pulled up a web page and held it out. "That was Dr. Simone Washington. Perhaps you'd like to know what she was doing this morning before she graced your establishment with her presence." Harold's eyes flickered to the screen, where photographs showed Simone standing at a podium, dressed in the same blazer she'd worn into his store, but now the context transformed everything. Behind her, a massive screen displayed complex molecular structures, and the headline read, "Revolutionary Cancer Research Breakthrough. Dr. Simone Washington's team discovers novel treatment pathway." The color drained from Harold's face as Marcus continued scrolling through article after article. She just delivered the keynote address at the International Science Summit. Her research team has developed a groundbreaking approach to targeting previously untreatable forms of cancer. The medical community is already talking about a Nobel Prize nomination. The classical music that had seemed so sophisticated moments ago now felt like a mockery of refinement. Harold's legs suddenly felt weak, and he found himself leaning against a display case containing the very books Simone had been examining. The first edition of Origin of Species seemed to stare back at him accusingly. But she was... Harold's voice trailed off as he realized every justification he might offer would only compound his shame. The security cameras that had earlier seemed to validate his suspicions now stood as silent witnesses to his prejudice. Marcus wasn't finished. He pulled up another article, this one featuring Simone accepting a prestigious award. Last year, she received the National Medal of Science. The president personally presented it to her for her contributions to molecular biology and biochemistry. Her research has saved thousands of lives, Harold. Thousands. The magnitude of his error began to sink in as Harold watched Trevor, the same employee who had rushed to report Simone's presence, now frantically Googling her name on his phone. The young man's face showed the same dawning horror that Harold felt creeping through his own chest. "She comes from a family of educators," Marcus continued, his voice taking on the same measured tone he used when delivering closing arguments. "Her mother, the woman she was shopping for? She's Dr. Margaret Washington, former dean of education at Howard University. The woman you suggested should shop at department stores has probably forgotten more about grace and dignity than most of us will ever know." Other customers had begun to drift closer, their own phones out, murmuring as they discovered who had just been in their midst. The whispers grew like waves, each one carrying fragments of Simone's achievements across the store's pristine floor. "Did you see her TED Talk? My sister's oncologist uses her research protocols. She was on the cover of Scientific American." Harold's world, which had seemed so orderly and proper just minutes ago, was crumbling like ancient parchment. He remembered every word of his interaction with Simone, each one now returning to him with the sharp clarity of regret. Her composure, her dignity, her reference to molecular biology, it all took on new meaning in light of who she actually was. "The scarf she mentioned," Marcus added, twisting the knife of revelation deeper, "was probably for the ceremony next week. She's receiving the Lifetime Achievement Award from the National Academy of Sciences. At 42, she's the youngest recipient in the organization's history." The crystal chandeliers overhead seemed to dim, as if even they were embarrassed by what had transpired beneath their sparkle. Harold found himself staring at his reflection in one of the store's many mirrors, seeing himself through new eyes. His carefully maintained appearance, which had always seemed to him the armor of respectability, now looked like a hollow costume. "She's scheduled to speak at 3 more international conferences this month," Marcus continued, his lawyer's precision making each fact land like a gentle but firm indictment. "Research facilities around the world consult her. The treatment protocol she developed last year has been adopted by every major cancer center in the country. And today, Harold, she walked into your store looking for a gift for her mother." The weight of revelation pressed down on the store's atmosphere like a physical force. Even the usual sounds, the soft footsteps of shoppers, the gentle clink of hangers, the whisper of tissue paper, seemed muted, as if the very space was holding its breath in shock. Sarah, who had shared Trevor's earlier suspicious glances, now stood frozen behind the counter, her face a mask of mortification as she scrolled through her own phone disk, overing article after article about the woman they had just driven from the store. The security cameras continued their impassive recording, capturing the moment when recognition transformed into regret, when assumption crumbled in the face of reality. The afternoon sun, slanting through the windows at a deeper angle now, cast long shadows across the floor, like fingers pointing toward the door through which Simone had departed with such dignity. Harold stood in one of these shadows, feeling the darkness of his actions contrast sharply with the brilliant light of the woman he had so grievously misjudged. After closing the store that evening, Harold remained in his office, the overhead lights dimmed to a soft glow that matched his somber mood. The leather of his executive chair, usually a comfort, now felt like a throne of thorns. On his desk, dozens of browser tabs displayed articles about Dr. Simone Washington, each one a testament to the magnitude of his error. The security footage from earlier played on a loop on one of his monitors, and he found himself studying it with the same intensity he once reserved for examining counterfeit luxury goods. But now, instead of looking for flaws, he saw only his own. The way he had positioned himself slightly too close, subtly intimidating. The dismissive tilt of his head, the practiced condescension in his stance, all of it recorded in high definition, a documentary of discrimination he couldn't bear to stop watching. His eyes drifted to the old photograph on his desk, yellowed with age but carefully preserved behind glass. In it, a much younger Harold stood outside a different store, his clothes threadbare but clean, his expression hopeful as he clutched a job application. The memory of that day rushed back with unexpected force. The way the store owner had looked at him, the son of Jewish immigrants, with that same dismissive glance he had just given Simone. "You people should stick to your own neighborhoods," the owner had said, not even bothering to look at his references or impressive sales records from his previous job. Harold had sworn then that he would never forget that feeling, that he would build something better, something more inclusive. Yet here he sat, 40 years later, having become the very thing he had once despised. The irony twisted in his chest like a knife. He picked up the photograph, running his thumb along its worn edge. His father's voice echoed in his memory. "Remember where you came from, Harold. Remember what it feels like to be judged before you speak." How had he forgotten? When had the warmth of his father's teachings cooled into the rigid prejudices he now displayed? The quiet hum of the office's climate control system provided a subtle soundtrack to his contemplation. On his computer screen, a video began playing automatically, Simone delivering her TED Talk from 2 years ago. Her voice filled his office, confident and passionate as she explained complex scientific concepts with remarkable clarity. "In the world of molecular biology," she was saying, "we learn that every cell contains the potential for greatness. The difference lies not in their fundamental nature, but in the environment they're given to flourish." Harold felt the words strike him like physical blows. He thought of his own daughter, Rebecca, fighting for respect in her corporate law firm, coming home some days close to tears because of the subtle ways her male colleagues undermined her. How many times had he comforted her, assured her of her worth, raged against the unfairness of it all? Yet today, he had become the very obstacle he despised in others. The security footage continued its relentless replay. He watched Simone's exit again, noting now what he had missed before, the way she had maintained her dignity, the gentle precision of her movements, the scientific metaphor she had offered even in the face of humiliation. She had tried to teach him something, even as he was showing her the door. His eyes burned with unshed tears as he remembered his mother's stories of being turned away from stores in their old neighborhood. "They judge the package," she used to say, arranging her modest clothes with dignity, "but they miss the gift inside." He had promised himself he would never be that kind of person, would never perpetuate that kind of pain. When had he forgotten these lessons? When had the pride in his success calcified into prejudice? The playlist of videos continued, showing Simone accepting awards, delivering lectures at prestigious universities, working with patients who had benefited from her research. In each one, She exhibited the same grace and intelligence she had shown in his store, the same dignity he had chosen to ignore. A soft knock at his office door startled him from his reverie. Trevor, the young sales associate who had first raised the alarm about Simone's presence, stood in the doorway, his usual confidence replaced by visible distress. "Mr. Hawthorne," Trevor began, his voice unsteady, "I've been thinking about what happened today. I was the one who started it all. If I hadn't..." Harold raised a hand to stop him.
No, Trevor.
"The responsibility is mine. I'm the owner. I set the tone. I've been setting it for years without even realizing it." The admission tasted bitter, but he forced himself to continue. "When did we start assuming we could judge someone's worth by their appearance? When did we become so afraid of difference that we forgot our own humanity?" The question hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Through his office window, Harold could see the store's main floor, now empty and quiet. The displays of luxury goods, usually so impressive, seemed to mock him with their superficial beauty. Everything in the store was designed to project exclusivity, but somewhere along the way, they had confused exclusivity with exclusion. He thought about the generations of customers who might have never entered his store because they anticipated the treatment Simone had received. How many brilliant minds, kind hearts, and unique perspectives had he turned away? How many connections had been lost? How many opportunities squandered? All because he had allowed fear and prejudice to become his business model. The moon had risen outside, casting silver light across the marble floors. Harold stood, his decision already forming. The store had been his father's dream, passed down to him with the promise of creating something beautiful. Somewhere along the way, he had corrupted that dream, turning it from a space of appreciation for beautiful things into a fortress of exclusion. Tomorrow would bring changes. But first, he had to face the hardest part, acknowledging his mistake not just to himself, but to the person he had wronged. The thought of facing Dr. Washington filled him with dread, but also with a strange sense of hope. Perhaps in confronting his failure, he might find a path to becoming the person he had once promised himself he would be. The Scientia Café buzzed with the quiet energy of academic discourse, its warm lighting and exposed brick walls creating an atmosphere that felt worlds away from the sterile elegance of Hawthorne and Sons. Harold stood outside for several minutes, watching through the window as Dr. Simone Washington engaged in animated discussion with a group of colleagues. Her hands moved expressively as she explained something, her face lit with the same passion he'd seen in her research videos. His palms were sweating, and he fought the urge to straighten his tie for the 100th time. For the first time in decades, he had deliberately dressed down, wearing a simple sweater and slacks rather than his usual armor of bespoke suits. The choice had been conscious, an attempt to shed the artifice that had become so much a part of his persona. Through careful networking and a few discreet inquiries, he had discovered her schedule. The knowledge that she regularly met colleagues at this cafe on Wednesday afternoons had brought him here, his heart pounding with an anxiety he hadn't felt since his first job interview. The irony wasn't lost on him, how the tables had turned, how he now felt the same uncertainty he had so carelessly inflicted on others. As he watched, Simone's colleagues began gathering their things, preparing to leave. One by one, they said their goodbyes, leaving her alone with her laptop and a half-finished cup of tea. Harold recognized this as his moment, yet his feet seemed rooted to the sidewalk. Through the window, he could see her pull up what appeared to be research data, her focus absolute, her presence commanding even in this casual setting. Finally, drawing upon reserves of courage he wasn't sure he possessed, Harold pushed open the cafe door. The gentle chime of bells announced his entrance, mixing with the soft jazz playing over hidden speakers and the whir of the espresso machine. A few patrons looked up briefly before returning to their work, but Simone remained absorbed in her data. Harold approached her table with measured steps, each one feeling like a mile. When he reached the edge of her peripheral vision, he saw her stiffen slightly, her hands pausing over her keyboard. She had recognized him, without even looking up. "Dr. Washington," he began, his voice barely above a whisper. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Simone looked up slowly, her expression carefully neutral. The afternoon light streaming through the cafe's windows illuminated her face, highlighting the subtle weariness around her eyes, the kind that came not just from long hours of research, but from a lifetime of navigating spaces that weren't always welcoming. "Mr. Hawthorne," she acknowledged, closing her laptop with deliberate care. "I admit, I'm surprised to see you here." Her tone was neither hostile nor welcoming, but carried the same composed dignity she had shown in his store. "I understand if you'd prefer I leave," Harold said, remaining standing, aware that sitting uninvited might seem presumptuous. "But I needed to speak with you face to face." He paused, gathering his thoughts. "What happened in my store, there's no excuse for it."
None.
"I've spent the past few days watching your lectures, reading about your work, and His voice caught.
I'm ashamed.
"Not just of how I treated you, but of how long I've allowed such behavior to be part of my business." Simone studied him for a long moment, her eyes keen with the same analytical precision she brought to her research. "Please sit," she finally said, gesturing to the chair across from her. As Harold settled into it, she continued, "You know, I almost didn't come to your store that day. I've learned to anticipate certain reactions, to choose my battles. But my mother always said that the only way to change perceptions is to challenge them, one interaction at a time." The whir of the espresso machine filled the silence between them as Harold absorbed her words. A barista called out someone's order, the normalcy of the moment contrasting sharply with the weight of their conversation. "Your mother sounds like a wise woman," Harold said softly. "I wish I had honored her teachings better when you visited my store." He placed his hands flat on the table, a gesture of openness. "In my research about you these past few days, I learned about your work on cellular adaptation, how cells can change their behavior based on their environment. It made me think about how environments like my store, like my attitude, they don't just affect the people we exclude. They transform us too, make us smaller, less human." Simone's expression softened slightly, the scientist in her recognizing the apt metaphor. "Yes, cellular environments can either nurture growth or inhibit it. The same is true for human environments." She paused, taking a sip of her tea. "Mr. Hawthorne, what exactly are you hoping to achieve with this conversation?" The question hung between them, direct and challenging. Harold felt the weight of it, the demand for honesty rather than mere politeness. "I'm not here to ask for forgiveness," he said carefully. "I'm not here to ease my conscience or protect my store's reputation. I'm here because I need to acknowledge my failure, not just to you, but to every person who might have felt unwelcome in my store. I'm here because silence in the face of one's own prejudice is a form of cowardice, and I've been a coward for too long." A small smile touched the corner of Simone's mouth, not one of joy, but of recognition. "You know, in science, we have a saying, the first step in solving a problem is acknowledging its existence. The second step is gathering data. The third is implementing change based on that data." She leaned forward slightly. "You've taken the first step, Mr. Hawthorne. You've gathered your data by learning about me, about your own history. The question now is, what changes will you implement?" The challenge in her words was clear, but so was the opportunity they presented. Harold felt something shift inside him. Not the lifting of guilt, but the settling of purpose. "I have some ideas," he said, "but I would value your insight. Your experience, both as someone who faced discrimination in my store and as a scientist who understands systematic change, could help ensure that any changes I make are meaningful rather than merely cosmetic." The afternoon light had begun to fade outside the cafe windows, casting long shadows across their table. In this gentler illumination, both Harold and Simone seemed to relax slightly, the rigid roles of offender and offended softening into something more nuanced, two people engaging in the complex work of understanding and change. The morning light filtered through the newly cleaned windows of Hawthorne and Sons, catching the dust motes that danced in the air as Harold stood before his assembled staff. The store wouldn't open for another 2 hours, but every employee was present, watching their boss with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. The elegant chairs from the vintage furniture section had been arranged in a semicircle, turning the main floor into an impromptu meeting space. "Yesterday," Harold began, his voice carrying the weight of recent revelation, I had a conversation that changed my perspective on everything we do here. He paused, making eye contact with each staff member. Trevor shifted uncomfortably in his seat, while Sarah twisted her hands in her lap. But before I tell you about that conversation, I want to tell you about my father. Harold pulled out an old photograph from his jacket pocket, holding it up for all to see. The image showed a much younger version of his father standing proud but nervous in front of a small shop window. My father came to this country with nothing but his skills as a craftsman and his dream of creating something beautiful. When he opened this store, he had a vision, not just of selling luxury items, but of creating a space where beauty and craftsmanship could be appreciated by anyone who understood their value. He set the photograph on a nearby display case. Somewhere along the way, we lost sight of that vision. We began confusing exclusivity with exclusion, prestige with prejudice. Last week, we turned away one of the most brilliant scientists of our generation because we judged her based on appearance rather than character. We've probably turned away countless others whose stories we'll never know. The silence in the room was absolute, broken only by the soft hum of the climate control system. Even the usually bustling street outside seemed to have quieted, as if sensing the gravity of the moment. Starting today, Harold continued, standing straighter. We're implementing changes. Not superficial adjustments, but fundamental transformations in how we operate. He gestured to a woman standing near the door, previously unnoticed by the staff. This is Dr. Elena Rodriguez from the Center for Inclusive Business Practices. She'll be working with us over the next 6 months to reshape our approach to customer service and community engagement. Dr. Rodriguez stepped forward, her presence both professional and approachable. Thank you, Mr. Hawthorne. Our first session today will focus on understanding unconscious bias and its impact on both business and human interaction. But more importantly, we'll be working together to develop practical strategies for creating a truly welcoming environment. The next 3 hours unfolded in a series of exercises and discussions that challenged long-held assumptions. Trevor, who had first raised the alarm about Simone, found himself sharing a story about his own grandmother's experiences with discrimination. Sarah spoke about realizing how her own prejudices had been shaped by years of working in luxury retail. As the morning progressed, Harold watched his staff engage with increasing openness and honesty. The elegant showroom became a space for vulnerable conversations about privilege, prejudice, and possibility. Display cases that had once seemed like barriers now served as props in exercises about accessibility and inclusion. Remember, Dr. Rodriguez emphasized, luxury and exclusivity don't require exclusion. True excellence in service means making every person who walks through those doors feel valued, regardless of their appearance or background. That afternoon, as the staff prepared to open the store, Harold gathered them once more. A craftsman was carefully installing a new plaque near the entrance, its brass surface gleaming in the light. The words were simple but powerful. All who appreciate beauty are welcome here. This isn't just a decoration, Harold explained, running his fingers over the engraved letters. It's a promise, to ourselves and to our community. Every person who walks through these doors deserves our respect, our attention, and our best service. The changes continued throughout the week. The security cameras, once used to monitor suspicious customers, were supplemented with a new system that focused on customer service opportunities. Staff members were trained to recognize when someone might need assistance rather than surveillance. Harold worked with Dr. Rodriguez to develop a comprehensive training program that would become mandatory for all new hires. The program emphasized cultural competency, conscious inclusion, and the art of genuine hospitality. They created scenarios based on real experiences, including the incident with Dr. Washington, using them as teaching tools rather than sources of shame. The physical space itself began to transform. The intimidating barrier of the front counter was redesigned to be more welcoming. Displays were rearranged to be more accessible. Even the music changed, incorporating a diverse range of classical and contemporary pieces that reflected the global origins of their luxury items. Most significantly, Harold initiated a community outreach program. He partnered with local organizations to offer internships to students from underrepresented communities interested in luxury retail and design. The store's elegant event space, previously reserved for private showings, was open for cultural events and educational programs. As these changes took root, something remarkable began to happen. The atmosphere in the store shifted subtly, but unmistakably. The air of exclusivity remained, but it was no longer tinged with exclusion. Instead, it carried the warmth of genuine welcome, the excitement of discovery, and the richness of diverse perspectives coming together in appreciation of beauty and craftsmanship. The invitation arrived at Simone's office on heavy cream-colored paper, the elegant letterhead of Hawthorne and Sons embossed in subtle gold. Inside, Harold's careful handwriting extended an invitation to an evening of science and beauty, a special event celebrating the intersection of scientific achievement and artistic excellence. The day was set for exactly 3 months after their confrontation. Simone sat at her desk, turning the invitation over in her hands as the late afternoon sun cast long shadows across her research papers. Her first instinct was to decline. The memory of that day still carried a sting, despite Harold's subsequent apology and their meaningful conversation at the cafe. But as she studied the invitation more closely, certain details caught her analytical eye. The event, she noticed, wasn't just a simple reception. It was designed as a celebration of women in STEM fields, with proceeds from the evening sales going to a scholarship fund for underrepresented students in science. The guest list included not only scientists but also educators, artists, and community leaders, a deliberate attempt to bridge worlds that too often remained separate. After careful consideration, Simone picked up her phone and dialed her mother's number. Dr. Margaret Washington answered on the second ring, her voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent navigating similar situations. "What do you think, Mom?" Simone asked after explaining the invitation. "Should I go?" Her mother's response was measured but clear. "You once told me that the best experiments are the ones that challenge our assumptions. Perhaps this is one of those experiments." That evening, Simone sent her RSVP, accepting the invitation with a mixture of cautious optimism and professional curiosity. She approached it as she would any experiment, with careful observation and an openness to unexpected results. The evening of the event arrived with a kind of crisp clarity that often follows autumn rain. Hawthorne and Sons had been transformed. The usual displays of luxury goods remained, but they were now interspersed with elegant installations highlighting scientific achievements. Glass cases that once held only vintage watches now also contained beautifully crafted models of molecular structures. Interactive displays showed the artistic side of scientific imaging, crystallography patterns that could have been modern art, cellular photographs that rivaled abstract paintings. When Simone arrived, wearing a deep blue evening dress that perfectly balanced elegance with professionalism, she immediately noticed the changes. The security cameras remained, but they were now supplemented by welcoming staff members who greeted each guest with genuine warmth. The former barrier-like counter had been replaced with several smaller, more accessible consultation areas. Even the lighting felt different, warmer, more inviting. Harold met her at the entrance, not in his usual formal suit, but in a more approachable business casual attire. "Dr. Washington," he greeted her, his voice carrying both respect and a hint of nervousness. "Thank you for coming. Your mother?" "She'll be joining us shortly," Simone replied, noting the subtle ways his demeanor had changed since their first encounter. She was intrigued by her invitation. As they moved through the store, Simone observed the mixed crowd of guests. Young scientists chatted with established artists, community leaders engaged with luxury clients, and students from local schools wandered wide-eyed through the displays, their presence part of Harold's new community outreach program. The evening centerpiece came when Harold gathered everyone for his address. Standing beneath the crystal chandeliers, he spoke not as the imperious owner she had first encountered, but as someone transformed by his own journey of understanding. 3 months ago, he began, his voice carrying clearly through the hushed space, this store failed in its most basic duty, the duty to recognize and respect the dignity of every person who walks through our doors. That failure led to a profound revelation, and an even more profound change. He gestured to the newly installed displays. Tonight, we celebrate not just the beauty of craftsmanship, but the beauty of human achievement in all its forms. We honor not just the artisans who create our luxury items, but the scientists who push the boundaries of human knowledge, the educators who shape future generations, and the community leaders who build bridges between different worlds. As Harold spoke, Simone noticed Trevor, the young sales associate who had once viewed her with suspicion, now expertly guiding a group of young Black and Hispanic students through an interactive display about crystallography and jewelry design. Sarah, who had shared Trevor's initial prejudice, was deep in conversation with a woman in a hijab about the scientific principles behind fabric conservation. The transformation wasn't just cosmetic. It was evident in the genuine engagement between staff and guests, in the thoughtful way the space had been reorganized to be more welcoming, in the subtle but significant changes that spoke of true understanding rather than mere compliance. When Dr. Margaret Washington arrived, elegant in a silk scarf that Simone recognized from Hawthorne's own collection, Harold welcomed her with genuine respect and interest in her work in education. The moment could have been awkward, but instead became an opportunity for meaningful dialogue about the intersection of education, science, and social change. As the evening progressed, Simone found herself engaged in conversations that moved fluidly between scientific theory and artistic appreciation. She watched as her mother, holding court near a display of vintage educational texts, shared stories with a rapt audience about her experiences breaking barriers in academia. The event concluded with the announcement of a new partnership between Hawthorne and Sons and several local schools, creating opportunities for students to learn about both the science and artistry behind luxury goods. The scholarship fund, Harold announced, would be named in honor of Dr. Margaret Washington's contributions to education. Later, as the crowd began to thin, Simone found herself standing with Harold near the first edition of Origin of Species that had caught her attention on that first visit. "You know," she said, "Darwin's theory wasn't just about survival of the fittest. It was about adaptation, about how species change and grow in response to their environment." Harold nodded, understanding the parallel. "And sometimes," he replied, "the most important adaptations come from recognizing our mistakes and learning from them." He paused, looking around at his transformed store. "This isn't the end of our journey toward true inclusion, Dr. Washington. It's just the beginning." Simone smiled, noting how the evening light now seemed to welcome rather than judge. "In science," she said, "we call that a promising preliminary result." The store that had once been a symbol of exclusion had begun its transformation into something rarer and more valuable, a space where beauty, in all its forms, could truly be appreciated by all who sought it. As Simone left that evening, the new brass plaque by the door caught the light, its message simple but profound: all who appreciate beauty are welcome here. This time, she knew, the words were more than just an inscription. They were a promise being kept.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.